The train cut through the night like a steel blade, hissing across the vast American plains. Inside the rattling boxcars, hundreds of German prisoners sat in silence, their breath forming pale ghosts in the cold air. None of them knew where they were being taken. None of them had ever imagined they would live long enough to see the enemy's homeland. And yet here they were rolling deeper into a country they had been taught to underestimate, fear, and dismiss. Outside the narrow slits of the wooden walls, the world flashed by in blurs of light and shadow. A distant hum floated through the dark, steady, unnatural, almost mechanical in its confidence. It wasn't the roar of artillery or the rumble of tanks. It was something else. Something constant. Something endless. Feldwebel Kurt Voss pressed his ear to the timber. He heard it again. A low, unbroken thunder, as if the earth itself were breathing. At first he believed it was the sea, until he remembered America's coasts were still days away. Then he thought it might be a storm. But storms did not pulse with rhythm. They did not move with purpose. They did not sound like a giant waking from sleep. A guard opened the sliding door for fresh air, and a burst of icy wind tore into the car. For a single moment, the prisoners saw the outside world, lit factories stretching toward the horizon, chimneys throwing sparks into the night, entire towns glowing bright despite the rationing and the war raging across the ocean. Lines of trucks snaked along the highways. Trains loaded with steel and machinery thundered in the opposite direction. Everything moved, everything worked, everything produced. The door slammed shut, plunging them back into darkness. But the image stayed burned into their minds like a flash of lightning. "What was that?" one prisoner whispered. No one answered. They all felt the same, tightening in their chests, an emotion they had never associated with America. It wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The train pressed on, rocking beneath them. The humming outside grew louder, deeper, almost alive. It was the sound of a nation that had not slowed down for war, but accelerated because of it. A nation that could feed millions, arm millions, and still have enough strength to build more. Kurt shut his eyes, but he could still see those endless factories, those burning lights, that horizon of production stretching further than any front line. Somewhere in that vast darkness, a truth waited for them, one that would strike harder than any battlefield defeat. They had not come to a fallen enemy. They had come to the heart of a giant. And by the time the sun rose, they would realize the war they thought they understood was far bigger and far more impossible than any of them had ever imagined. They had grown up believing a different story. Long before the train carried them across the endless plains, before the Allied patrols captured their units in Normandy and the Hurtgen forest, before the Reich began collapsing under fire and starvation, the men now sitting in American boxcars had been taught a simple truth. America was soft. Soft bodies, soft minds, soft culture, a land of movie theaters, dance halls, consumer goods, and jazz. A place where people wasted fuel driving enormous cars through cities of skyscrapers, where factories produced refrigerators and radios instead of weapons, where the population, according to German propaganda, had neither the discipline nor the ideological will to fight a long war, and most of the prisoners believed it. Kurt remembered the posters in Berlin cartoons showing fat Americans eating hamburgers as their machines rusted behind them. He remembered speeches from his officers, stern men who insisted the United States could never sustain a global conflict. "They have resources," one captain had said, "but they lack soul. They lack steel. They lack purpose. They lack us." Those words shaped the worldview of millions of German soldiers. Even when American tanks first appeared in North Africa, even when the skies above France filled with bombers, German commanders insisted that America's strength was temporary. They cannot replace their losses, they claimed. They cannot build faster than we can destroy. But as the war dragged on, that illusion began to crack. Not loudly, not suddenly, quietly like ice, shifting under pressure. Kurt noticed it first at the front lines, months before his capture. American uniforms looked newer. Their boots didn't fall apart in the mud. Their rations, strange metal cans filled with meat, vegetables, even chocolate, seemed endless. German soldiers joked bitterly about American luxury, passing around empty C rations boxes like relics. "How many of these do they have?" one man had asked. "Enough to feed every soldier on Earth," another answered. They laughed, but the laughter carried strain. Tools, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, everything the Americans used appeared to flow from an invisible river. While German units waited weeks for replacement barrels or new tank tracks, American supply depots overflowed with crates and spares stacked higher than vehicles themselves. Still, the illusion of German superiority held on. Their officers insisted the Americans were clumsy, untrained, dependent on machines rather than skill. They said American soldiers relied on firepower because they were afraid to fight. They said the U.S. Army needed 10 men to do the work of 1 German. They said American victories came only from brute numbers, not precision or discipline. But none of those explanations survived contact with reality. The prisoners on the train remembered the firestorms that rolled over them in Normandy, the barrages so intense the earth turned liquid. They remembered columns of American Sherman tanks, not individually superior, but attacking in coordinated waves, supported by artillery, engineers, and endless fuel trucks that never seemed to stop arriving. They remembered aircraft. Hundreds, thousands. More than any sky should be able to hold. And still, some part of them believed America must be straining, must be at the breaking point, must be nearing collapse under the weight of its own machinery. They believed it until the moment the train door opened and they saw the industrial horizon glowing brighter than the sunrise. Now, sitting in the darkness of the rocking car, the prisoners felt those old illusions unravel. The memories of propaganda, pride, and arrogance came back to them not as comforts, but as ghosts. Kurt thought of his first days in the Reich Labor Service, digging trenches and stacking bricks, while listening to supervisors praise German engineering. "We lead the world," they declared. "No nation matches our precision. No nation matches our innovation." But innovation required materials. Precision required factories. Victory required production. And production required something Germany had never possessed in abundance: space, resources, energy, and the economic mindset that treated industry as the heart of national survival. America, on the other hand, had all of it and more. The German soldiers had heard rumors, assembly lines turning out aircraft faster than Nazi factories could repair damaged ones, shipyards launching Liberty ships in a matter of days, steel mills pouring fire into molds that cooled into the bones of weapons shipped across 2 oceans. But rumors had been easy to ignore. A single glimpse through the train door could not be ignored. Kurt tried to push the image from his mind, but he couldn't. He had seen too much, too many chimneys, too many lights, too many machines moving with the calm regularity of a world untouched by war's hunger. He wondered what Berlin looked like now. He wondered if any factory still stood. He wondered if the German people truly knew what they were fighting against. He doubted it. The prisoners around him shifted uncomfortably. The wooden floor creaked beneath their boots. No one spoke, but every man felt it, the slow, heavy sinking of realization. They had not lost the war, yet not officially, but deep in their hearts, they sensed the truth. They had been wrong about their enemy, wrong about themselves, wrong about the world beyond the Reich. Germany had marched into war fueled by ideology. America had entered it fueled by industry. And industry, cold, logical, mechanical, relentless, was proving to be the sharper weapon. The train continued its journey, rocking gently as it cut through the sleeping heartland. The humming outside did not fade. If anything, it grew. The closer they came to their destination, the louder the rhythm became, steady, confident, unstoppable. It sounded nothing like the Germany they came from. It sounded like a future they had never imagined, a future their commanders had never prepared them to face. And for the first time since their capture, Kurt Voss felt a tremor of fear, not of battle, not of punishment, but of truth. The truth that everything he had believed about America was a lie. Morning came without warning. A blade of white light sliced into the boxcar as the door clattered open. The German prisoners winced, shielding their eyes, blinking away the blur of night. Cold air poured in, carrying the scent of something unfamiliar, not smoke, not mud, not burned diesel. It smelled clean, sharp, metallic, almost electric. "Out!" the American guard shouted, his voice echoing across the rail yard. Kurt and the others climbed down, boots thudding against the packed earth, and then, for the first time since setting foot in the United States, they saw everything. The rail yard stretched wider than any depot they'd known in Germany, tracks branching like veins, crisscrossing into the horizon. Freight trains rumbled past in both directions, each one longer than a battlefield column. Flat cars stacked with tanks wrapped in canvas, gondolas overflowing with steel bars, tankers carrying fuel by the millions of gallons. The noise thundered, unbroken, relentless. Engines roared, wheels screeched. Giant cranes swung overhead like mechanical giants lifting the bones of war. A locomotive blasted its horn deep, powerful, confident. Another followed, and another. The sound rolled across the yard like a storm. Kurt stared, stunned. "How many trains are there?" whispered Muller beside him. Kurt didn't answer. There was no number for this. Not one had ever learned. The guards marched them across the gravel, weaving between tracks as iron monsters screamed by. A passing locomotive shook the ground beneath their feet. Warm wind washed over them, smelling of coal and speed. The train wasn't slowing. It wasn't even struggling. It was moving with purpose, like time itself made of steel. For a moment, Kurt forgot he was a prisoner. He felt like an archaeologist stumbling upon a civilization far more advanced than anything he'd been told existed. They exited the rail yard through a chain-link gate, and the sight beyond struck harder than any artillery blast. The factory complex looked like a city made of metal smokestacks stretching into the sky. Conveyor belts running between buildings like bridges, pipes twisting overhead, furnaces burning with a steady orange glow, even in daylight. Trucks lined up in rows. Engines humming, waiting to be loaded. Workers in denim and helmets moved with practiced rhythm, unloading crates, stacking barrels, guiding forklifts that zipped across concrete like insects in a hive. Everything moved, everything worked, everything produced. An American guard followed Kurt's gaze. "Bethlehem Steel," he said with casual pride, as if naming something obvious like a river or a mountain. "Plates for ships, beams for factories, armor for tanks. This place doesn't sleep." He didn't say it to impress the prisoners. He said it the same way a farmer might say, "These are my fields. Ordinary, unremarkable, just part of life." But to the Germans, it was a revelation. Kurt had once toured a Krupp plant near Essen. It had been considered a jewel of German industry smokestacks, foundries, assembly buildings. But Krupp had looked like a toy compared to what he saw now. This American complex dwarfed it, overwhelmed it, consumed it. The scale was so enormous, he struggled to process it. Muller whispered, "My God, how can anyone bomb this?" Kurt shook his head. "Even if you destroyed it, 10 more would replace it." A whistle blew. A column of workers streamed out of one building while another column marched in, overlapping shifts like machine gears. There was no pause. No break. No hesitation. This wasn't wartime desperation. This was wartime acceleration, and it terrified them. The prisoners were herded toward trucks waiting on a paved lot. The asphalt was dark and smooth, without a single shell crater, without cracks from weight or cold. The roads leading away from the factory stretched wide 4 lanes, clean edges, access ramps built with mathematical precision. Kurt had seen German roads earlier in the war, proud autobahns that stretched like banners of national strength. But even the autobahns had fallen into disrepair under constant military strain, patched with gravel, scarred by tank tracks and bomb blasts. These American roads looked untouched by war. As if war were something that happened far away. As if war belonged to other continents. The trucks rumbled to life. Their engines growled, smooth and rich with fuel. They drove the prisoners through a landscape that felt unreal, fields of corn stretching in perfect rows, barns freshly painted, towns with intact windows and clean sidewalks. Children rode bicycles down the streets. Women hung laundry in the open air. Men walked to work with lunch pails. Kurt felt something twist inside him. The war had ripped Europe apart, turning villages into ruins and cities into graveyards. In Germany, the sky was black with smoke, food was rationed to the bone, every street bore scars, every home carried fear. But here, life went on, life flourished. America was fighting a global war, and yet it looked untouched. No, not untouched, empowered. As the trucks rolled to a halt beside another industrial complex, the shock deepened. This one was a shipyard, and it was alive. Cranes the size of buildings swung steel plates onto the skeleton of a ship rising from the dry dock. Sparks rained from welders perched along its spine. Thousands of workers moved like ants over the hull, each performing a task in perfect coordination. A ship was being born before their eyes. Kurt watched in awe as a foreman shouted instructions, his voice carrying above the din. "Another Liberty ship," an American guard said. "They build 'em fast here, couple of weeks, sometimes less. Weeks." Kurt's breath caught. German shipyards took months, years to build large vessels, slowed by limited resources, shortages, and constant bombing. But this looked unstoppable. A whistle sounded. Another dry dock revealed the skeletal frame of a second ship already halfway complete. Beyond it stood a third, its hull nearly ready for launch. Tugboats buzzed in the water, guiding newly finished vessels out toward the bay. "How many do they make?" Mueller asked softly. The guard shrugged. "Depends on the week." Kurt felt the weight of that sentence fall onto his shoulders like a mountain. For Germany, one ship was a miracle. For America, a ship was a week. They were outmatched not by a margin, but by an ocean. The prisoners were moved again, this time to a temporary holding building inside the shipyard. The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time since arriving, silence replaced the thunder of productivity. The men sat on benches, stunned. "What we saw," one whispered. "It was impossible." Another replied, "No, it was America." Kurt kept his eyes on the floor, wrestling with thoughts that refused to settle. He remembered the words of his old captain. "They cannot build faster than we can destroy." But the captain had never been here. He had never seen a shipyard that could replace an entire fleet before Germany could sink it. He had never heard the hum of factories that could produce vehicles by the thousands, guns by the tens of thousands, ammunition by the millions of rounds. He had never imagined a nation with industrial arteries pumping steel and fire without slowing, without starving, without fear. Kurt felt suddenly small. Not as a soldier, but as a man. Everything he had believed about power, about strength, about possibility, was collapsing. Brutal truth. Germany's war machine wasn't defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated here on the assembly lines, in the furnaces, in the shipyards. It was defeated by a country capable of producing infinity. Hours passed before the guards returned. The prisoners were lined up and marched out again, this time toward a warehouse labeled Supply Depot, WWII. Inside, Kurt froze. Stacks, mountains, pyramids of crates, barrels, tools, tires, uniforms, helmets, blankets, rifles, everything labeled, sorted, categorized with perfect efficiency. Shelves rose to the ceiling. Forklifts zipped along aisles, marked with painted numbers. Workers checked inventory with clipboards, hardly noticing the German prisoners passing through. One guard chuckled. "This is just one depot. There are dozens like it." Kurt swallowed hard. "For all of this?" "For the army," the guard said casually. "The Navy has their own. So does the Air Force. And the Marines." The Germans exchanged looks of disbelief. 4 branches. Each with its own endless supply chain. Each with its own factories. Each fully fed by a national machine that seemed inexhaustible. Germany had 1 military industry. America had 4. And each one could outproduce the Reich alone. Kurt felt his chest tighten. He had seen enough. But America wasn't finished showing him. After a final march through the depot, the guards brought them to an open field, where dozens of trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, generators, Tractors and machines Kurt couldn't even name sat in neat rows. Some were painted olive drab, others grey, others yellow for construction. All of them were new, brand new, not repaired, not scavenged, not rebuilt. New. A mechanic wiped grease from his hands and looked over at the prisoners. War surplus, he said, nodding toward the machines with a grin. These are the ones we don't need, the ones they don't need. Kurt felt dizzy. Germany fought over every machine, every vehicle, every tool. Nothing was surplus. Nothing was extra. Nothing went unused. But America had more than it could deploy, more than it could store, more than it required to fight a two-ocean war. As the prisoners stood in stunned silence, the sound returned the hum they'd heard from the train, the industrial heartbeat of the United States. It vibrated through the ground, through the machines, through the very air. It was all around them. A reminder, a warning, a truth. The war they thought they knew was unwinnable. That night, in the POW camp, Kurt lay awake on his bunk. The barracks were quiet except for the occasional snore or rustle of blankets. Outside, the guards patrolled with heavy boots, their voices drifting through the cold. But Kurt didn't hear them. He heard the shipyard. The factories. The rails. The infinite machine. He heard America. And he understood deeply, painfully, that Germany had not been defeated by superior tactics or superior soldiers. Germany had been defeated by something far greater, a nation that could outbuild, outproduce, and outlast every enemy on earth. A nation whose power came not from ideology, but from industry, not from speeches, but from steel, not from faith, but from factories. The shock settled into his bones like winter cold. The Reich could never match this. No one could. Night settled over the camp like a thick blanket, smothering the last traces of daylight. The lights around the perimeter flickered on pale yellow bulbs, strung along tall wooden poles, casting faint circles onto the frosted ground. The air smelled of pine, distant smoke, and winter. It was quiet, too quiet. Kurt sat on the edge of his bunk, hands clasped between his knees, staring at the wooden floorboards. The roar of the factories had faded behind them, but the memory of it still vibrated faintly in his chest, like an echo refusing to die. He could still see the shipyards, still see the freight trains, still see the endless rows of machines America didn't even need. That was what haunted him the most, not what the Americans used, but what they threw aside. The barracks creaked. Someone coughed. Someone else turned in his sleep. But most of the prisoners lay awake, staring into the darkness with eyes that saw far beyond the wooden walls. They were no longer thinking about escape, or rations, or what tomorrow's work detail might bring. They were thinking about home, Germany. The cities they left behind, Dresden, Cologne, Essen, once proud, now scarred by fire. Streets filled with rubble. Factories that had once fueled the Reich, now silenced or buried beneath craters. Families living in fear of the next night raid. Ration lines stretching around corners. And above it all, the creeping collapse, slow, suffocating, inevitable. Kurt swallowed hard. We were never meant to win, he whispered to himself. He didn't mean it as despair. He meant it as revelation. A late revelation, one that tasted like ash. Across the room, Muller sat against the wall, knees pulled up to his chest, staring out a small, fogged window. The two hadn't spoken since they arrived at the camp. There was nothing left to say. Words felt useless, too small to hold what they'd seen. But now Muller spoke, voice barely audible. Kurt, did you notice something today? Kurt lifted his eyes. What? The Americans, Muller said. They weren't rushing. Kurt blinked. Rushing? Muller nodded slowly, his breath visible in the cold. The workers. The trucks. The cranes. They moved quickly. Yes, but not out of fear. Not out of desperation. They worked as if they had time, as if the war was just another task, something they would finish eventually, like building a barn or paving a road. Kurt felt the words sink slowly into him. He had seen it too. but he hadn't recognized it until now. The Americans didn't work with urgency, they worked with certainty. Germany built under pressure. America built under confidence. They don't think they'll lose, Muller said. Not even for a moment. Kurt closed his eyes. Because they won't. A long silence followed. The next morning was grey and brittle. Frost clung to the barracks roof, sparkling under the first weak rays of sunlight. The prisoners stood in formation outside, breath rising like mist. A light wind brushed across the compound, carrying the faint sound of a train whistle from somewhere beyond the hills. That sound pierced the men more deeply than any command. Trains in Germany meant retreat, evacuation, shortages. Trains in America meant supply, abundance, movement. Two worlds separated by an ocean and by something far greater than water. A guard barked an order, and the prisoners began their walk to the morning work detail. They marched past fences and watchtowers, past the guardhouse, past a shed where neatly stacked tools waited. Nothing was broken, nothing was in disrepair, nothing was makeshift. Even in a prisoner of war camp, America had structure. Kurt found himself assigned to a lumber crew that morning, cutting and hauling logs to be used for additional barracks. It was simple work. Honest work. The kind of labor he had done in his youth before the war swallowed everything. The American overseer, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard, handed out saws and axes. Not rusty tools, not blunt ones, clean, sharp, oiled tools, tools that felt good in the hand. Work steady, the overseer said. Break when you need to. His tone wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even authoritative. It was human. And that, in its own way, cut deeper than any factory or shipyard. German officers had warned them. Americans were brutal. Americans were decadent. Americans were cold. Americans were weak. But the man handing out tools treated them like workers, not animals. Mueller leaned close to Kurt. This is not how I imagined captivity. Kurt didn't respond. His throat felt tight. Hours passed. The prisoners worked in silence, cutting logs, stacking lumber, carrying planks across the yard. The rhythmic swing of the axes created a strange calm. Every strike felt like a heartbeat. Every slice into the wood a moment of clarity. As Kurt worked, memories rose unbidden. The sound of church bells in his hometown. Moments before the war when life was simple, full, whole. He wondered what remained of that world. He feared the answer. A loud crack split the air. One of the prisoners had snapped the handle of his axe. He froze, expecting punishment. The overseer walked over, examined the broken tool, and shrugged. "These things happen," he said, tossing the ruined handle aside. He handed the prisoner a new one. "Try not to break this one." No shouting, no threat, no humiliation. Kurt felt the contrast so sharply it almost hurt. In Germany, breaking equipment, any equipment, was a punishable offense. At best a reprimand, at worst a beating. Here, it was an inconvenience. Because America had more tools, more wood, more steel, more oil, more everything. There was no fear of running out. There was no fear at all. When the midday bell rang, the prisoners gathered near the mess shack, sitting on benches, eating their rations, beans, bread, a slice of ham, food richer than what many German civilians had left. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Muller broke the silence. "Do you think the people at home understand?" he asked softly. Kurt stared at his tin cup, watching steam rise from it. "No, they can't. They haven't seen this." Muller ran a hand through his hair, eyes distant. If they knew, if they really knew, would they still believe in victory? Kurt shook his head. Belief doesn't matter. The truth does. He paused. And the truth has already chosen sides. A cold gust swept across the yard. The prisoners huddled deeper into their coats. Kurt looked up at the American flag fluttering above the camp entrance, its colors bright even against the dull winter sky. Had never given that flag much thought before the war. But now, looking at it from behind a barbed fence, he felt something he never expected. Respect. Not for the symbol itself, but for what the symbol represented, a nation that could take its sons across oceans, feed them, fuel them, arm them, and still have enough strength left to overwhelm the world. Kurt whispered. We never stood a chance. That evening, as dusk settled over the camp, the prisoners were allowed a brief walk outside the barracks. They strolled quietly, hands in pockets, eyes tracing the horizon beyond the fence. For the first time, Kurt noticed the distant glow, faint but unmistakable. The glow of factories. The glow of cities. The glow of a country burning not with destruction, but with creation. A creation so vast it drowned out every gunshot, every strategy, every speech. A creation so vast it could not be defeated. Müller came to stand beside him. Kurt, he said, voice low and fragile, do you think Germany will survive this war? Kurt didn't answer immediately. He watched the glow. He felt the hum beneath his feet. He remembered the shipyards and the roaring trains. He thought of his home beautiful, wounded, fragile. He thought of the Reich crumbling under the illusion of its own strength. Finally he spoke. Germany may survive, he said, but the world she tried to create, that world is already dead. Müller nodded slowly. His eyes glistened. They stood there, side by side, two soldiers no longer soldiers, two men no longer proud, two human beings confronting a truth too vast to ignore, the truth that wars are not won by courage alone, nor by ideology, nor by will. Wars are won by the ones who can build, by the ones who can create more than the enemy can destroy, by the ones whose factories, not their armies, shape the outcome. Kurt let out a long breath. America builds faster than we can fight, he said quietly, faster than we can retreat, faster than we can surrender. Müller closed his eyes. Then the war was over long before we knew. A silence settled between them. Heavy, deep, final. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of shame, but the silence of realization. The collapse was no longer happening in Germany, it was happening inside them, and in that cold American twilight, they finally understood the scale of what they had witnessed. They had not seen factories. They had seen destiny. Dawn crept slowly over the camp the next morning, its pale light brushing across the frost-covered ground like a quiet apology. The world seemed still muted, gentle, suspended between night and day. The prisoners emerged from their barracks in silence, their breath drifting upward in thin white ribbons. A thin mist clung to the fences. Somewhere beyond the evergreens, a distant whistle drifted across the valley. Kurt paused on the step, listening. A train, another one, of course. It was always there, the hum of the machine, the pulse of a nation that never stopped moving. Even here, in a camp surrounded by timber and snow, the sound found them, a reminder, a truth. He stepped into the cold, boots crunching softly beneath him. The other prisoners gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices, their faces drawn with a quiet introspection that had settled in overnight. No one joked. No one argued. No one clung to old illusions. Something had shifted. It was not surrender. It was not defeat. It was understanding. Müller joined Kurt at the fence line. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the horizon lighten as the sun broke above the ridge. The glow bloomed slowly soft, orange, steady. It reminded Kurt of the forge head scene in the shipyard, molten metal flowing like captured dawn. He exhaled. Amazing, he murmured. Müller followed his gaze. The sunrise. Kurt shook his head gently. That, and everything behind it. The two men watched in silence as the camp woke around them. Guards walked their posts. American cooks stoked fires in the mess hall. Trucks rumbled awake on a nearby road. And farther away, far too far to see but not too far to feel, the factories stirred again, their chimneys exhaling smoke into the new morning. The hum returned, low, constant, eternal. And Kurt realized something important, something he had not understood even after witnessing the shipyards, the steel mills, the depots. This sound was not a wartime phenomenon. It was not a temporary surge. It was America itself, a country built on production, motion, abundance, scale, a country whose greatest weapon was not a tank or a plane, but a mindset, the belief that anything could be built, and built again, and built better. He felt it in his bones now. Germany had fought with everything it had. America hadn't needed to. Not yet. Not fully. Perhaps not ever. The irony settled like ash on Kurt's tongue. Germany had believed the war would be decided by courage. America had known it would be decided by capacity. Germany celebrated valor. America celebrated output. Germany honored endurance. America honored efficiency. In the end, both nations revealed their souls. One produced heroes, the other produced history. Kurt wrapped his coat tighter as the morning breeze swept through the yard. The cold no longer bothered him. Not after everything he had seen. Mueller spoke again, voice distant. "Do you think they know?" he asked. "The Americans? Do you think they understand the power they have?" Kurt watched a line of workers drive past outside the fence, ordinary men in ordinary clothes, lunch pails in hand, heading to factories that stretched beyond the horizon. Some laughed. Some smoked. Some hummed as they walked. They did not look like conquerors. They did not posture. They did not boast. They simply lived. Kurt shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I don't think they see it as power at all. I think it's just Tuesday." Mueller smiled sadly. There was no malice in Kurt's voice, no bitterness, just awe, the kind of awe that stripped away pride and left only truth. He turned from the fence and looked at the camp, at its clean barracks, at its well-organized tools, at the order and calmness of its routines. Even captivity here reflected the same efficiency, the same abundance, the same steady rhythm. War had burned Europe to its knees. War had enriched America's momentum. Kurt understood now the cruel irony. Some nations survive war. America thrives on it. Not because it loves destruction, but because it has mastered creation. He took a long breath, letting the cold fill his lungs. The sun was higher now, its light warming the top of the fence, turning the barbs into glinting silver. Behind him, the prisoners lined up for roll call, boots scraping softly against the frozen ground. The guards read out numbers. A pen scratched across a clipboard. A flag rippled in the morning air. Everything moved with calm precision. Everything worked. Everything continued. As Kurt stepped into formation, he cast one last glance toward the distant glow, toward the furnaces, the cranes, the rail yards, the heart of a nation that produced more than the world could comprehend. Wars, he realized, were not decided by how bravely men fought. They were decided by what those men returned to, by what their nations could build for them, by what resources flowed behind them. And America's rivers never seemed to run dry. He stood a little straighter, the dawn warming his face. No anger, no despair, just clarity. The war had already chosen its victor long before the first shots were fired. Not through destiny, not through ideology, through industry. As the loudspeaker crackled to life and the morning routine began, Kurt closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could still hear the hum, that endless, indifferent, unstoppable hum, and he knew deeply, irrevocably, that long after the uniforms were folded away and the guns fell silent, that sound would remain, because it was not the sound of war. It was the sound of a nation that built the world it wanted, and the world would never be the same. Weeks passed. Winter softened. The snow around the camp thinned into patches of wet earth and pale grass. The prisoners settled into a rhythm work, meals, evening walks, quiet conversations. Life became predictable, almost gentle, and yet beneath that routine, something deeper stirred. Kurt felt it every morning when he stepped outside, every evening when the sun set behind the hills, every night when he lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. It was the sense that he had crossed an invisible line, one that divided the man he had been from the man he was becoming. He no longer saw America as an enemy. He no longer saw Germany as invincible. He saw the world as it truly was, vast, complex, and shaped not by ideology or pride, but by the hands that built it. One afternoon, while assigned to repair the fence along the northern boundary of the camp, Kurt paused to catch his breath. Through the trees, he glimpsed a distant road, and along that road, a convoy of American trucks thundered past, olive drab, canvas tops flapping, engines roaring with that same steady hum. But something was different now. Kurt didn't feel threatened by the sight. He felt humbled. Muller joined him, carrying a bundle of wire. "They never stop," he remarked, shaking his head with a mixture of awe and resignation. Kurt glanced at the convoy again. "No," he said softly. "They don't." He knew the trucks were headed for another depot, another port, another ship waiting to cross the Atlantic and feed another front. Supplies for soldiers who would fight in places these prisoners had once marched into with certainty. Supplies that flowed effortlessly through a system so large that even its excess was greater than Germany's total capacity. The realization didn't hurt anymore. It simply was. That evening, after the work detail ended, an American officer visited the barracks. He was older than most grey at the temples, shoulders square, steps slow but firm. He carried a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, "we'll be moving some of you to new camps in the coming months. Farther north, farther west, depends on labor needs." The prisoners listened without protest. They no longer felt the instinctive resistance that had colored their early days. They understood their place now not as prisoners, but as witnesses inside a country too massive to grasp all at once. Kurt watched the officer leave. For a moment he wished he could ask him something, anything. What drives this nation? What fuels it? Do Americans realize the scale of their own power? But the officer was already gone. Later that night, Kurt stood alone outside the barracks door. The sky above was clear stars scattered like sparks across a blacksmith's anvil. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, silvering the tops of the fences and the tips of the pine trees. It was quiet, until it wasn't. Far away, so faint it was almost imagined, came the sound. A rumble, a vibration, a low mechanical heartbeat echoing through the ground. Factories, trains, shipyards, always working, always building, always humming. Kurt closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. It was no longer frightening, no longer overwhelming. It was something else now, something almost comforting. The hum represented order, possibility, capacity. Germany's sound had been the cry of war, urgent, sharp, unsustainable. America's sound was different. It was the sound of a nation that would continue long after the fires of conflict burned out. A nation whose strength came not from conquering others, but from constructing itself. Muller stepped up beside him. "You hear it too, don't you?" Kurt nodded. "Yes. What do you think it means?" Kurt breathed in the cold air, letting the answer form slowly. "I think," he said quietly, "it means that the world will rebuild after the war, and I think America will lead that rebuilding." Muller let the words settle. He didn't argue. He didn't scoff. He simply accepted because denial had no place left between them. The irony wasn't lost on either man. They had arrived here as enemies. They would leave here changed, not American, not defeated, but awakened. Awakened to the truth that the future belonged not to those who commanded fear, but to those who commanded production. Not to those who built empires of ideology, but to those who built engines, ships, railways, roads, and the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure that made nations powerful beyond measure. Kurt lifted his gaze to the stars one last time. "We fought against this," he whispered. "But someday, we may need to learn from it." A long silence followed. Then Muller spoke, barely audible. "Empires fall, but factories leave their mark." Kurt nodded. "And some marks shape the world." The hum rose again on the night air, deep, steady, enduring. Not a threat, not a warning, just a truth. The truth of a nation that built its own destiny, and in doing so, reshaped everyone else's. And as the two men stood quietly at the fence, listening to the heartbeat of American industry echo across the land, they understood finally, completely, that the war had not merely captured their bodies, it had captured their perspective. And what remained after the hum was clarity.